We're usually here 15 minutes early.
Yeah, Katie and Nick are usually first here, I reckon.
All right, very good.
Frankie, you're a little
Everybody.
Hey.
Hey, Frankie.
Oh, hello.
How are you doing, sweets?
Good, thank you. How are you?
And it's Friday.
Very good. It is Friday.
Friday.
Did your dance wife have a good birthday? Good. Yeah. Did you go around and say hi?
Sorry, darling?
Did you go around and say hi from the end of the garden? I
didn't. I couldn't do that. We're all supposed to stay in our houses.
Oh, yeah, come on.
She, yeah, it sounds like she's had a lovely day and she got nice presents and things. And
Sweet.
yeah, thank you to everyone who sent her cards and stuff like that. That's really very appreciated.
How are you, Malcolm? Haven't spoken for a while.
Good. Yeah, all right, I guess.
Fresh face today.
Yes. I shaved off my facial hair. Sorry, Jenny. I got a bit bored with it. If I can't do the full thing, then I shouldn't. Well, anyway, I'll probably go through phases of growing something back and then having to shave some off.
Jenny, you look so snug in your jungly bed.
You do. I'm very jealous of your jungly surroundings. Malcolm is in the jungle as well.
It's what?
Mine's a green screen.
Ah.
It's not my actual.
Oh, yeah, I know.
What is that?
You are actually in the wood.
Damn it.
It looks like some sci-fi vortex. Is it a wood? That's what.
What nicer
It is a
chocolate?
wood. Yeah, okay.
You're saying the chocolate I brought you isn't nice enough?
Yeah.
Do you need to switch your video off? Or are we okay?
We'll be fine. I mean, you lot will be fine. I might die.
We're at a safe distance.
How are you, Mike, sweetie?
Good, thank you. Yeah, well, good. I was checking how many other mics there were on screen before I. Yeah. I think we've only got 3 on so far, so we're good.
Yeah, we haven't yet reached full mic saturation.
Maximum mic.
Maximum mic. You, Mike Cox. How are you?
Full named. Brilliant. I'm good, thank you very much. Yeah, all good. I've been spending the last half hour frantically finding animal poetry. See if I can find a good one.
How exciting!
Looking forward to tomorrow.
Yeah, definitely. Me too. We're going to have some T.S. Eliot from the beautiful Katie. Hi, Katie.
Hey, Frankie.
Hey, baby girl. How you doing?
I'm good. Do you have any preference as to which poem I read?
Absolutely not.
It would be much easier if you did.
Dealer's choice.
Oh, dear.
Whatever makes you feel happiest.
I'm watching Fleabag tomorrow night. Oh, no, actually tonight after this with a friend from California. So I'm going to dial in quite late. Yeah, good.
Ah, that's brilliant. I'm watching it on Sunday with Martin. Very excited. Very excited.
Can we come? Or is it a you and Martin date?
It's a me and Martin date. I mean, like, you can definitely also watch it on Sunday, even at the same time. I don't think we would see you there. When the house lights go down, it's really difficult to see who else is in the audience. We might run into each other in the lobby at the interval, I guess. That would be nice.
Buzz baby, when the lights go down. Do 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 do. No? Nobody else? No? That's what
I'm dancing. Keep going. I'm enjoying it. I'm digging it.
Show you what it's all about. Something else. Blah, 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 blah. That's all I got, sorry.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
It's glorious.
I have a very vibrant looking gem.
Let's see.
Although it's not covered. It's just a luminous bottle.
What?
From Edinburgh?
Is it Fireheart? You shouldn't drink that.
It looks a bit like Fireheart, doesn't it?
It does.
It had not crossed my mind.
Very thematically appropriate.
Maybe not the capital.
Mm.
What is that, Ivan?
What's Ivan got?
It's a projector.
I don't know. He's muted, so I can't
Oh,
see.
it's a reel-to-reel.
Oh. What are you doing?
Sorry,
Yvonne, what are you doing?
I'm trying to service it because the speed is wrong.
That's cool.
Well, it's awkward getting parts.
When you leaned over and the light was shining on your shirt, it looked like a sniper, the kind of light of a sniper rifle. I was like,
This is a test tape, but I've got tapes that are irreplaceable.
oh my god. What's on the tapes?
Music, documentaries, but one of the voices on the documentaries died last week. When the music, the drummer, the keyboard player, the composer, half of them are dead. They died.
This is the Maltese stuff, right?
Yeah. They died quite young,
Yeah.
and some of the material is not in circulation. It's never been published.
Oh, I hope you can manage to salvage it then.
Well, that's a challenge. I need this machine to work, and then I need to try and make it compatible with the recordings because they're recorded on a completely different machine.
Yeah.
Keep my fingers crossed for you.
I know, it's a nightmare.
Hey Carmen. Hey Martin. Hey everybody. Hi Nina. Hi Lisa. Oh god, look, a whole slew of lovely people all joining at once. Hey Kim. Hey Jonathan.
Hey, Jenny.
How y'all doing? How you doing, Lisa? You looking beautiful. Your hair looks exquisite as always.
Aww.
Ever since you took the sword from that soldier and started hacking up the walkers like a badass.
Yeah.
This does wonders for your hair.
Yeah.
I think it was the blood kind of got in and like just strengthens it, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's protein, isn't it? It's like a protein map.
Well, if you remember when they killed that guy, it was very much nourishing the roots.
That's so true. Yeah, like that's quite intensive skincare. But if you're really serious about it, then those are the
Well, you know I'm
lengths
dedicated.
to go to. Yeah. Yeah, when I run out of sheet masks, that's going to be the next logical conclusion. Right, how are we doing for time? Oh, I've got give it another minute or so. See if anyone else rocks up, and then dive straight in.
This gin has, slightly aniseedy juniper flavors, which I quite enjoy. I know some people would find less good, but no, it's subtle enough to be just tasty, rather than sort of in the ouzo direction.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely delicious. Are you as a gin and tonic, or are you drinking it with something outre?
No, as a gin and tonic with lemon, because that's all I got. I can see your face. Really very upset.
No comment. If it's got an anise element, maybe you could put a star anise pod or something in there.
Although it's already had that. That's the idea.
It's true. I just think they're pretty.
Yeah.
They're very, very pretty pods.
I'm sure earlier in the Storytime journey we had a discussion about who liked licorice in the Storytime watchers and who didn't.
Did we?
Yeah, it was marzipan versus licorice.
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 Delicious. I've got some licorice sticks kicking around, like the actual, like licorice twigs kicking around my room somewhere, and they're fun.
Of course you do.
Like those.
Twigs are forest themes, they are, do
you know on them.
There's your snack for the final party.
Oh yeah. Ooh, I don't think it's necessarily a snack that would work great on camera. Like there's quite a lot of kind of intensive chomping. It's, you know, it's nothing that you can eat seductively off a spoon, let's put it that way. It's the only kind of snack that I really care about. Right, I think should we start looking at
story time?
Jonas, story
Jonas, get Jonas in.
Jonas!
He's busy making more kaya.
I mean, that is a very worthy cause.
It's very important.
Story
But this is
time
more
is for
important.
no man or condiment, breakfast or otherwise.
There he is! Yay!
Yay!
Successfully stalled. Right.
What a beard you've got, sir.
Oof. Jonas.
Yeah, it's just growing wilder and wilder.
Yay. Beard.
He also got some of the soldier's blood.
Yeah.
Very big household all round. Right. Beautifuls. I'm going to mute you all. So, chapters 18 and 19 tonight. We seem to be on a sort of 2 chapter at a time bender. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Chapter 18. They took me downstairs and put me into a small, unused stateroom for lack of any place better. The guards kept watch outside the door while their captain went off, my letter in hand, to find out what ought to be done with me. My legs were ready to give out on me, but there was nothing to sit on but a few alarming chairs pushed up against the wall, delicate, fragile-looking confections of white paint and gilt and red velvet cushions. I would have thought any one of them a throne if there hadn't been 4 in a row. I leaned against the wall for a while instead, and then I tried sitting on the hearth, but the fire hadn't been lit in here for a long time. The ashes were dead and the stone was cold. I went back to the wall. I went back to the hearth. Finally, I decided that no one could put a chair in a room and not mean anyone to sit on it, and I gingerly perched on the edge of one of the chairs, holding my skirts close against me. The moment I sat, the door opened and a servant came in, a woman in a crisp black dress, something like Danka's age, with a small pursed mouth of disapproval. I sprang up guiltily. 4 long, gleaming red threads followed me, unravelling from the cushion, caught on a burr in my skirt, and a long, sharp, white-painted splinter snagged in my sleeve and broke off. The woman's mouth pursed harder, but she only said, "This way, please," stiffly. She led me out past the guards, who didn't look sorry to see the back of me, and took me back up yet another different staircase. I'd seen 6 in the castle already, and showed me to a tiny dark cell of a room on the 2nd floor. It had a narrow window that looked out on the stone wall of the cathedral. A rain spout shaped like a wide mouth and hungry gargoyle sneered in at me. She left me there before I could think to ask what to do next. I sat down on the cot. I must have slept, because by the next thought I had, I was flat on the cot instead. It wasn't a deliberate choice. I didn't even remember lying down. I struggled up, still sore and weary, but too conscious that I had no time to waste and no idea what to do. I didn't know how to make anyone pay attention to me unless I went to the middle of the courtyard and began to lob fire spells at the walls. I doubted that would make the king any more inclined to let me speak at Kasha's trial. I was sorry now that I'd given the dragon's letter away, my only tool and talisman. How did I know it had even been delivered? I decided to go find it. I remembered the guard captain's face, or at least his moustache. There couldn't be many moustaches like that, even in all Kralia. I stood up and pulled the door open boldly, walked out into the hallway, and nearly ran straight into the falcon. He was just raising his hand to the latch on my door. He flowed deftly back out of my way, saving us both, and gave me a small, gentle smile that I didn't trust at all. "I hope you're feeling refreshed," he said, and offered me his arm. I didn't take it. "What do you want?" He turned the gesture neatly into a long, inviting sweep of his hand towards the hallway. "To escort you to the Korovnikov. The king has given orders you're to be examined for the list." I was so relieved that I didn't quite believe him. I eyed him sidelong, half expecting a trick. But he kept standing there with his arm and smile, waiting for me. "At once," he added, "although perhaps you'd care to change first." I would have liked to tell him what to do with his mocking little hint, but I looked down at myself. All mud and dust and sweat-stained creases, and underneath the mess a homespun skirt that stopped just below my knee, and a faded brown cotton shift, worn old clothes I'd begged off a girl in Zatachek. I didn't look like one of the servants. The servants were dressed far better than me. Meanwhile, Solya had exchanged his black riding clothes for a long robe of black silk with a long sleeveless coat embroidered in green and silver over it, and his white hair spilled over it in a graceful fall. If you had seen him from a mile away, you would have known him for a wizard. And if they didn't think me a wizard, they wouldn't let me testify. "Try and present a respectable appearance," Sarkin had said. Van Astelem gave me clothes to match the mood of my sullen muttering. A stiff and uncomfortable gown of rich red silk, endless flounces edged in flame orange ribbons. I could have used an arm to lean on at that, trying to negotiate stairs in the enormous skirt without being able to see my feet, but I grimly ignored Solya's subtly renewed offer at the head of the staircase and picked my way slowly down, feeling for the edges of the steps with my tight-slippered toes. He clasped his hands behind his back instead and paced me. He remarked idly, "The examinations are often challenging, of course. I suppose Sarkin prepared you for them?" He threw me a mildly inquiring glance. I didn't answer him, but I couldn't quite keep myself from dragging my bottom lip through my teeth. "Well," he said, "if you do find them difficult, we might provide a joint demonstration to the examiners. I'm sure they would find that reassuring." I only glared at him and didn't answer. Anything we did, I was sure he'd take the credit for. He didn't press the matter, smiling on as though he hadn't even noticed my cold looks. A circling bird high above, waiting for any opening. He took me through an archway flanked by two tall young guards who looked at me curiously, and into the Korovnikov, the Hall of Wizards. I slowed involuntarily coming into the cavernous room. The ceiling was like an opening into heaven, painted clouds spilling over a blue sky and angels and saints stretched across it. Enormous windows poured in the afternoon sunlight. I stared up, dazzled, and almost ran myself into a table, reaching blindly to catch myself with my hands on the corner and feeling my way around it. All the walls were covered in books, and a narrow balcony ran the full length of the room, making an even taller second level of bookcases. Ladders hung down from the ceiling on little wheels all along it. Great work tables stood along the length of the room, heavy solid oak with marble topping them. "This is only an exercise in delaying what we all know has to be done," a woman was saying, somewhere out of sight. Her voice was deep for a woman, a lovely, warm sound, but there was an angry edge to her words. "No, don't start bleating at me again about the relics, Ballo. Any spell can be defeated. Yes, even the one on Holy Blessed Jadwiga's shawl, and stop looking scandalized at me for saying so. Solya's gone drunk on politics to lend himself to this enterprise in the first place." "Come, Alosha. Success excuses all risks, surely," the Falcon said mildly as we rounded a corner and found 3 wizards gathered at a large round table in an alcove with a wide window letting in the afternoon sun. I squinted against it after the dim light of the palace hallways. The woman he'd called Alosha was taller even than me, with ebony dark skin and shoulders as broad as my father's, her black hair braided tightly against her skull. She wore men's clothes, full red cotton trousers tucked into high leather boots and a leather coat over it. The coat and the boots were beautiful, embossed with gold and silver and intricate patterns, but they still looked lived in. I envied them in my ridiculous dress. "Success," she said. "Is that what you call this? Bringing a hollow shell back to the court just in time to burn her at the stake?" My hands clenched. But the falcon only smiled and said, "Perhaps we'd best defer these arguments for the moment. After all, we aren't here to judge the Queen, are we? My dear, permit me to present you to Alosha, our sword." She looked at me, unsmiling and suspicious. The other two were men, one of them the same Father Ballo who'd examined the Queen. He didn't have a single line creasing his cheeks, and his hair was still solidly brown, but he somehow contrived to look old anyway, his spectacles sliding over a round nose in a round face as he peered up and down at me doubtfully. "Is this the apprentice?" The other man might have been his opposite, long and lean in a rich wine-red waistcoat embroidered elaborately in gold and a bored expression. His narrow pointed black beard curled up carefully at the tip. He was stretched in a chair with his boots up on the table. There was a heap of short, stubby golden bars on the table beside him, and a small black velvet bag heaped with tiny glittering red jewels. He was working 2 bars in his hands, magic whispering out of him. His lips were moving faintly. He was running the ends of the gold together, the bars thinning under his fingers into a narrow strip. "And this is Ragostok, the Splendid," Solya said. Ragostok said nothing, and didn't even lift his head save for one brief glance that took me in from head to feet and dismissed me at once and forever as beneath his notice. But I preferred his disinterest to the hard, suspicious line of Alosha's mouth. "Where exactly did Sarkhan find you?" she demanded. They'd heard some version of the rescue by then, it seemed, but Prince Marek and the Falcon hadn't bothered with the parts of the story that didn't suit them, and there was more they hadn't known. I stumbled through an awkward explanation of how I'd met Sarkhan, uncomfortably aware of the Falcon's eyes on me, bright and attentive. I wanted to say as little as I could about Dvernik, about my family. He already had Kasha as a tool to use against me. I borrowed Kasha's secret fear and tried to hint that my family had chosen to offer me to the dragon. I made sure to say my father was a woodcutter, which I already knew they would disdain, and I didn't tell them any names. I said the village headwoman and one of the herdsmen instead of Danka and Jerzy, and made it sound as though Kasha was my only friend and not just my dearest, before I haltingly told them of her rescue. "And I suppose you asked nicely and the wood gave her back to you," said Ragostok without looking up from his work. He was pressing the tiny red jewels into the gold with his thumbs, one after another. "The dragon, Sarkhan," I found myself grateful for the small lift I felt from the thunder of his name on my tongue. "He thought the wood gave her to me for the chance of setting a trap." "So he hadn't lost his mind entirely by then," Alosha said. "Why didn't he put her to death at once? He knows the law as well as anyone." He let me try," I said. "He let me try to purge her. And then it worked. Or so you imagine," she said. She shook her head. "And so does pity lead straight to disaster. Well, I'm surprised to hear it of Sarkhan, but better men than he have lost their heads over a girl not half his age." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to protest, to say, "That's not it, there's nothing like that," but the words stuck in my throat. And do you suppose that I lost my head over her as well? The falcon said in amused tones. And Prince Marek in the bargain? She looked at him, an edge of contempt. When Marek was a boy of 8, he wept for a month demanding his father take the army and every wizard in all Polina into the wood to bring his mother back, she said. But he's not a child anymore. He should have known better, and so should you. How many men did this crusade of yours cost us? You took 30 veterans, cavalrymen, every one of them a prime soldier, every one of them carrying blades from my forge, and we brought back your queen, the falcon said, a sudden hard bite in his voice. If that means anything to you. Ragostok heaved a noisy and pointed sigh without even looking up from his golden circlet. What difference does it make at the moment? The king wants the girl tried, so try her already and let's be done with it. His tone made clear he didn't expect it to take long. Father Ballo cleared his throat. He reached for a pen, dipped it into an inkwell and leaned in towards me, peering through his small spectacles. You do seem rather young to be examined. Tell me, my dear, how long have you been studying under your master? Since the harvest, I said, and stared back at their incredulous eyes. Sarkhan hadn't mentioned to me that wizards ordinarily took 7 years of study before asking to be admitted to the list. And after I spent a good 3 hours flubbing half the spells they set me on, exhausting myself in the meantime, even Father Ballo was inclined to believe that Sarkhan had gone stupidly in love with me, or was having some sort of a joke at their expense to send me to be tested. The falcon was of no help. He watched their deliberations from the sideline with a mild air of interest, and when they asked him what magic he had seen me use, he only said, I don't think I can properly attest. It's always difficult to separate the workings of an apprentice from a master, and Sarkhan was there all the while, of course. I should prefer you all to make your own judgments. And then he looked at me from under his lashes, a reminder of that hint he'd given me in the hallway. I gritted my teeth and tried again to appeal to Ballo. He appeared the best chance for my sympathy, although even he was growing irritated. Sir, I've told you, I'm no use at these kind of spells. These are not any kind of spell, he said, peevish and purse-mouthed. We have set you at everything from healing magic to inscription, under every element and every quarter of affinity. There is no category which encompasses all these spells. But they're your sort of magic, not Yaga's, I said, seizing upon the example they would surely know. Father Ballo peered at me even more dubiously. Yaga? What on earth has Sarkhan been teaching you? Yaga is a folk story. I stared at him. Her deeds are borrowed from a handful of real wizards, mixed in with fanciful additions and exaggerated over the years into mythic stature. I gaped at him helplessly. He was the only one who had been polite to me at all, and now he was telling me with a straight face that Yaga wasn't real. Well, this has been a waste of time, Ragostok said. He hadn't any right to complain about that, though. He hadn't stopped working once, and by now his jewelled piece had become a tall circlet with a large socket in the middle, waiting for a larger gemstone. It hummed faintly with trapped sorcery. Pushing out a handful of cantrips isn't enough magic to make her worthy of the list, now or ever. Alosha had it right in the first place. What's happened to Sarkhan? He eyed me up and down. Without much excuse, but there's no accounting for taste. I was mortified and angry, and afraid even more than angry. For all I knew, the trial might start in the morning. I dragged in a breath against the hard whalebone grip of the corsets, pushed back my chair and stood, and under my skirts I stamped my foot on the ground and said, "Fulmia!" My heel came down jarring against the stone, a blow that rang through me and back out on a wave of magic. All around us, the castle shuddered like a sleeping giant, a tremor that made the hanging jewels on the lamp above our heads chime softly against one another and brought books thumping down off the shelves. Ragostok had jerked up to his feet, his chair going over, his circlet clattering out of his hands onto the table. Father Ballo stared around at the corners of the room with startled, blinking confusion before he transferred his astonishment to me, as if surely there had to be some other explanation. I stood panting with my hands clenched at my sides, still wringing head to foot, and said, "Is that enough magic to put me on the list? Or do you want to see more?" They stared at me, and in the silence I heard shouts outside in the courtyard, running feet. The guards were looking in with their hands on their sword hilts, and I realised I'd just shaken the king's castle in the king's city and shouted at the highest wizards in the land. They did, after all, put me on the list. The king had demanded an explanation for the earthquake and had been told it was my fault. After that, they couldn't very well also say I wasn't much of a witch. But they weren't very happy about it. Ragostok seemed to have taken offence enough to build a grudge on, which I thought was unreasonable. He'd been the one insulting me. Alosha regarded me even more suspiciously, as if she imagined I'd been hiding my power for some devious reason, and Father Ballo just disliked having to admit me on the grounds of my being outside his experience. He wasn't unkind, but he had all Sarkhan's obsessive hunger for explanation, with none of his willingness to bend. If Ballo couldn't find it in a book, that meant it couldn't be so, and if he found it in 3 books, that meant it was the unvarnished truth. Only the falcon smiled at me with that irritating air of secret amusement, and I could have done very well without his smiles. I had to face them in the library again the very next morning for the naming ceremony. With the 4 of them around me, I felt lonelier than in those early days in the Dragon's Tower, cut away from everything I'd known. It was worse than being alone to feel that none of them were my friend, or even wished me anything good at all. If I'd been struck by a bolt of lightning, they would have been relieved and not the least distressed. But I was determined not to care. The only thing that really mattered was being able to speak in Kasha's defence. I knew by now that no one else here would give her a moment's thought. She didn't matter. The naming itself seemed more like another test than a ceremony. They set me at a work table and put out a bowl of water, 3 bowls of different powders in red and yellow and blue, a candle and an iron bell inscribed around in letters of gold. Father Ballo placed the naming spell on a sheet of parchment in front of me. The incantation was 9 long, tangled words, with detailed annotations that gave precise instructions on the pronunciation of every syllable and how one ought to stress each word. I muttered it over to myself, trying to feel out the important syllables, but they sat inert on my tongue. It just didn't want to come apart. "Well," Ragostok said impatiently. I slogged my awkward, tongue-twisted way through the entire incantation and started to put the powder in the water, a pinch here and there. The magic of the spell gathered sluggish and reluctant. I made a brownish mess of the water, spilled some of all 3 kinds of powder on my skirt, and finally gave up trying to make anything better. I lit the powder, squinted through the cloud of smoke, and groped for the bell. Then I let the magic go, and the bell clanged in my hand, a long, deep note that came strangely out of so small a bell. It sounded like the great church bell in the cathedral that rang Matin every morning over the city, a sound that filled the room. The metal hummed beneath my fingers as I put it down and looked around expectantly. But the name didn't write itself on the parchment, or appear in letters of flame, or anywhere at all. The wizards were all looking annoyed, although for once not at me. Father Ballo said to Alosha in some irritation, "Was that meant for a joke?" She was frowning. She reached out to the bell and picked it up and turned it over. There wasn't a clapper inside it at all. They all stared into it, and I stared at them. "Where will the name come from?" I asked. "The bell should have sounded it," Alosha said shortly. She put it down. It clanged again, softly, an echo of that deep note, and she glared at it. No one yet knew what to do with me after that. After they all stood in silence for a moment while Father Ballo made noises about my irregularity, the falcon, he still seemed determined to be amused by everything to do with me, said lightly, "Perhaps our newest witch should choose a name for herself." Ragostock said, "I think it more appropriate we choose a name for her." I knew better than to let him have any part in picking my name. Surely I'd end up as the Piglet or the Earthworm. But it all felt wrong to me anyway. I'd gone along with the elaborate dance of the thing, but I knew abruptly I didn't want to change my name for a new one that trailed magic around behind it, any more than I wanted to be in this fancy gown with its long, dragging train that picked up dirt from the hallways. I took a deep breath and said, "There's nothing wrong with the name I already have." So I was presented to the court as Agnieszka of Tvernik. I half regretted my refusal during the presentation. Ragostock had told me, I think meaning to be nasty, that the ceremony would be only a little thing, and that the king didn't have much time to spare for such events when they came out of the proper season. It seems ordinarily new wizards were put onto the list in the spring and the fall, at the same time as the new knights. If he was telling the truth, I could only be grateful for it, standing at the end of that long, great throne room with a red carpet like the lolling tongue of some monstrous beast stretched out towards me, and crowds of glittering nobility on either side of it, all of them staring at me and whispering to one another behind their voluminous sleeves. I didn't feel like my real self at all. I would almost have liked another name on me then, a disguise to go with my clumsy, wide-skirted dress. I set my teeth and picked my way down the endless hall until I came to the dais and knelt at the king's feet. He still looked weary, as he had in the courtyard when we'd come. The dark gold crown banded his forehead, and it must have been an enormous weight, but it wasn't that simple kind of tiredness. His face beneath his brown and grey beard had lines like Christina's, the lines of someone who couldn't rest for worrying about the next day. He put his hands around mine, and I squeaked out the words of the oath of fealty, stumbling over them. He answered me with long and easy practice, took his hands back, and nodded for me to go. A page began making little beckoning motions at me from the side of the throne, but I realised belatedly that this was the first and just as likely only chance I had to ask the king anything. "Your Majesty, if you please," I said, trying hard to ignore the looks of puffing indignation from everyone near enough the throne to hear me. "I don't know if you read Sarkhan's letter." One of the tall, strong footmen by the throne almost at once got my arm, bowing to the king with a fixed smile on his face, and tried to tug me away. I planted my feet, muttering a sliver of Yaga's earth spell, and ignored him. "We have a real chance to destroy the wood now," I said, "but he hasn't any soldiers, and yes, I'll go in a moment," I hissed at the footman, who'd now got me by both my arms and was trying to rock me off the dais. "I only need to explain." "All right, Bartosz, stop breaking your back on her," the king said. "We can give our newest witch a moment." He was really looking at me now for the first time and sounding faintly amused. We have indeed read the letter and could have used a few more lines, not least about you. I bit my lip. What would you ask of your king? My mouth trembled on what I really wanted to ask. Let Kasha go, I wanted to cry out. But I couldn't. I knew I couldn't. That was selfishness. I wanted that for me, for my own heart's sake, and not for Ponya. I couldn't ask that of the king, who hadn't even let his own wife go without facing trial. I dropped my eyes from his face to the tips of his boots, gold embossed and just curling from underneath the fur trim of his robes. Men to fight the wood, I whispered. As many as you can spare, your majesty. We cannot easily spare any, he said. He held up a hand when I drew breath. However, we will see what can be done. Lord Spitco, look into the matter. Perhaps a company can be sent. A man hovering by the side of the throne bowed acknowledgement. I tottered away, suffused with relief. The footman eyed me narrowly as I went past him, and through a door behind the dais. It led me into a smaller antechamber where a royal secretary, a severe older gentleman with an expression of strong disapproval, stiffly asked me to spell my name. I think he had heard some of the scene I'd created outside. He wrote my name down in an enormous leather-bound tome at the heading of a page. I watched closely to be sure he put it down right and ignored the disapproval, too glad and grateful to care. The king didn't seem at all unreasonable. Surely he would pardon Kasha at the trial. I wondered if perhaps we might even ride out with the soldiers and join Sarkhan at Zatchek together to start the battle against the wood. When will the trial begin? I asked the secretary when he had finished writing my name. He only gave me an incredulous stare, lifted from the letter he'd already turned his attention to. I surely cannot say, he said, and then sent his stare from me to the door leading out of the room, a hint as pointed as a pitchfork. But isn't there... It must start soon, I tried. He had already looked back down at his letter. This time he raised his head even more slowly, as if he couldn't believe I was still there. It will begin, he said with awful enunciated precision, whenever the king decrees. Chapter 19. 3 days later, the trial still hadn't begun, and I hated everyone around me. Sarkhan had told me there was power to be had here, and I suppose for someone who understood the court, there would have been. I could see there was a kind of magic in having my name written down in the king's book. After speaking to the secretary, I had gone back to my tiny room, baffled and uncertain what to do next. And before I had been sitting on my bed for half an hour, the maids had knocked 5 times, carrying cards of invitation to dinners and parties. I thought the first one was a mistake. But even after I realised they couldn't all have gone astray, I still had no idea what to do with them or why they were coming. I see you're already in demand, Solia said, stepping out of a shadow and through my doorway before I could close it after yet another maid delivering yet another card. Is this something we're supposed to do? I asked warily. I had begun to wonder if perhaps this was a duty of the king's wizards. Do these people need some kind of magic done? Oh, it might come to that eventually, he said. But at the moment, all they want is the privilege of displaying the youngest royal witch ever named. There are already a dozen rumours flying about your appointment. He plucked the cards out of my hands, shuffled through them, and handed one out to me. Countess Bozoklava has by far the most useful. The Count has the king's ear, and he's sure to be consulted about the Queen. I'll take you to her soiree. No, you won't, I said. You mean they just want me to come and visit? But they don't even know me. They know enough, he said in patient tones. They know you're a witch. My dear, I really think you would be better off accepting my escort for your first outing. The court can be difficult to navigate if you're unfamiliar with its ways. You know that we want the same thing. We want the Queen and Kasha acquitted. You wouldn't give a crust of bread to save Kasha, I said, and I don't like the way you go about getting the things you want. He didn't let me chase away his manners. He only politely bowed himself backward into the shadows in the corner of my room. I hope you'll learn to think better of me by and by. His voice floated distantly out of the dark, even as he vanished. Do keep in mind that I am ready to be your friend if you find yourself at sea. I threw the card from Countess Boguslava after him. It fluttered to the ground in the empty corner. I didn't trust him at all, though I couldn't help but worry he was telling me part of the truth. I was beginning to understand how little I understood about the life of the court. To listen to Solya, if I showed my face at a party given by a woman who didn't know me, she would be pleased and tell her husband so, and he'd tell the king that the Queen shouldn't be put to death, and the king would listen? None of that made sense to me, but neither did strangers sending me a pile of invitations, all because a man had written my name down in a book. But here were the invitations, so plainly I was missing steps along the way. I wished I could speak to Sarkhan, half for advice, half to complain at him. I even opened up Yaga's book and hunted through it for a spell that would let me reach him, but I didn't find anything that seemed as though it could work. The closest was one called Kialmas, with the note, "To be heard in the next village," but I didn't think anyone would appreciate me shouting so loudly that my voice would go a week's distance across the country, and I didn't think the mountains would let the noise through anyway, even if I deafened everyone in Kralia. In the end, I picked out the earliest dinner invitation and went. I was hungry anyway. The last of the bread I'd saved in my skirt pocket was so stale by now that even magic couldn't make it go down easily or really fill my belly. There had to be kitchens somewhere in the castle, but the servants eyed me oddly when I went too far down the wrong hallway. I didn't want to imagine their faces if I went sailing into the kitchens. But I couldn't bring myself to stop one of those maids, a girl just like me, and ask her to serve me, as though I really thought myself a fine lady instead of just dressed up pretending to be one. I roamed up and down stairs and through hallways until I found my way back out to the courtyard, and there I girded myself and went to one of the guards on the door and asked him the way, showing him my invitation. He gave me the same odd look the servants did, but he looked at the address and said, "It's the yellow one, third in from the outer gate. Go down the road and you'll see it after you get around the cathedral. Do you want a chair, my lady?" He tacked on the last doubtfully. "No," I said, confused by the question, and set off. It wasn't a very long walk. The nobles lived in houses set inside the outer walls of the citadel, or the richest ones did anyway. The footmen at the yellow house stared at me too when I finally walked up to the entrance, but they opened the doors for me. I stopped on the threshold. It was my turn to stare. On my way, I had gone by more than one pair of men carrying peculiar tall boxes around the castle grounds. I hadn't known what they were for. Now one of them was being carried to the steps of the house right behind me. A footman opened up the door in its side, and there was a chair inside it. A young lady climbed out. The footman offered her a hand to step out onto the stairs of the house, but then he went back to his place. She paused on the lower step, looking up at me. I asked her doubtfully, "Do you need help?" She didn't stand as though she had a bad leg, but I couldn't tell what was beneath her skirts, and I couldn't imagine any other reason she would have shut herself up in such a bizarre thing. But she only stared at me, and then 2 more of the chairs came up behind her, discharging more guests behind her. It was just how they went from place to place. "Do none of you ever walk?" I asked, baffled. "And how do you keep from getting all over mud?" she said. We both looked down. I was a good 2 inches deep in mud all along the bottom of today's skirt, bigger around than a wagon wheel and made of purple velvet and silver lace. "I don't," I said glumly. That was how I met Lady Alicia of Lidzvar. We walked into the house and were immediately interrupted by our hostess, who appeared in the hall between us, greeted Lady Alicia very perfunctorily, then seized my arms and kissed me on both cheeks. "My dear Lady Agnieszka," she said, "how lovely that you were able to come, and what a charming gown. You are sure to start a new fashion." I stared at her beaming face in dismay. Her name had gone completely out of my head. But it didn't seem to matter. Even while I mumbled something polite and grateful, she twined her perfumed arms around mine and drew me into the sitting room where her guests were gathered. She paraded me around to everyone there, while I silently and fervently hated Solia all the more for being right. Everyone was so very glad to make my acquaintance. Everyone was scrupulously polite. At first, anyway. They didn't ask me for magic. What they did want was gossip about the Queen's rescue. Their manners were too nice to ask questions outright, but each of them said something like, "I've heard there was a chimera guarding her," letting the words trail off expectantly, inviting me to correct them. I could have said anything. I could have passed it off in some clever way, or claimed any number of marvels. They were plainly ready to be impressed with me, or to let me assume a heroic role. But I recoiled from the memory of that dreadful slaughter all around me, of blood watering the earth into mud. I flinched and blundered, answering with a flat no, or saying nothing at all, and dropping one conversation after another into an awkward hole of silence. My disappointed hostess finally abandoned me in a corner near a tree. There was an orange tree growing inside the house in a pot, and went to smooth over the ruffled feathers of her other guests. It was perfectly clear to me that if there was any good I could have done Kasia here, I'd just done the opposite. I was grimly wondering if I should swallow my reluctance and go find Solia after all, when Lady Alicia appeared at my elbow. "I didn't realise you were the new witch," she said, taking my arm and leading in conspiratorially. "Of course you don't need a sedan chair. Do tell me, do you travel by turning yourself into an enormous bat, like Baba Yaga?" I was glad to talk about Yaga, about anything besides the wood, and even more glad to find someone other than Solia willing to show me how to get on. By the time we had finished dinner, I had agreed to go with Lady Alicia to a breakfast and a card party and dinner the next day. I spent the next 2 days almost entirely in her company. I didn't think us friends, exactly. I wasn't in the mood to make friends. Every time I trudged back and forth from the castle to yet another party, I had to pass by the barracks of the Royal Guard, and in the middle of the courtyard stood the stark iron block, scorched and black, where they beheaded the corrupted before they burned their corpses. Alosha's forge stood nearby, and more often than not her fire was roaring, her silhouette raising showers of orange sparks with a hammer made of shadow. "The only mercy you can give the corrupted is a sharpened blade," she had said, when I tried to persuade her to at least visit Kasia once herself. I couldn't help but think maybe she was working on the headman's axe right then, while I sat in stuffy rooms and ate fish eggs on toast with the crusts cut off, and tea sweetened with sugar, and tried to talk to people I didn't know. But I did think Lady Alicia was kind, taking a clumsy peasant girl under her wing. She was only a year or two older than me, but already married to a rich old baron who spent most of his days at card parties. She seemed to know everyone. I was grateful and determined to be grateful, and I felt half guilty for not being better company or understanding the manners of the court. I didn't know what to say when Lady Alicia insisted on paying me loud and intensely fervent compliments on the excessive lace on my gown, or on the way I mangled the steps of a courtly dance when she persuaded some poor goggle-eyed young nobleman to take me on, much to the dismay of his toes and the amused stares of the room. I didn't realise she was mocking me all the time until the third day. We'd planned to meet at an afternoon music party held at the house of a baroness. There was music at all the parties, so I didn't understand what made this one especially a music party. Alicia had just laughed when I'd asked her. But I dutifully tramped over after lunch, trying my best to hold up my long silver frost train and balance the matching headdress, a long, curved, heavy swoop over my head that wanted to fall either backward or forward, either way as long as it didn't stay in place. Coming into the room, I caught the train in the doorway and stumbled, and the headdress went sliding back over my ears. Alicia caught sight of me and crossed the room in a dramatic rush to clasp my hands. "Dearest," she said urgently, breathlessly, "what a brilliantly original angle. I've never seen anything like it before." I blurted out, Are you trying to be rude?" As soon as the idea occurred to me, all the odd things she'd said and done came together and made a strange, malicious sense. But I couldn't believe it at first. I didn't understand why she would have. No one had made her talk to me or be in my company. I couldn't understand why she would have gone to the trouble just to be unpleasant. Then I couldn't doubt it any more. She put on a wide-eyed, surprised expression that plainly meant yes, she was trying to be rude. "Why, Nyashka," she began, as though she thought I was an idiot too. I pulled my hands free from hers with a jerk, staring at her. "Agnieszka will do," I said, startled and sharp. "And since you like my style so much, Katboru." Her own curved headdress tipped backward down her face, and took with it the elaborate, lovely curls to either side of her face, which were evidently false. She gave a small scream and clutched at them and ran out of the room. That wasn't the worst of it, though. Worse was the titter that went all around the room, from men I'd seen her dance with and women she'd called her intimate friends. I jerked off my own headdress and hurried over to the lavish refreshments, hiding my face from the room over bowls of grapes. Even there, a young man in an embroidered coat that must have taken some woman a year of work sidled up to my side and whispered in tones of glee that Alicia wouldn't be able to show her face at court for a year, as though that should have pleased me. I managed to duck away from him into a servant's hallway, and then in desperation I pulled out Yaga's book from my pocket until I found a spell for a quick exit, to let me pass through the wall of the house instead of going back inside and out the front door. I couldn't bear to hear any more poisonous congratulations. I came out through the yellow brick wall panting like I'd escaped from a prison. A small lion-mouthed fountain stood gurgling away in the centre of the plaza, the afternoon sun dazzling and captured in the basin, and a carved flock of birds around the top singing softly. I could tell at a glance it was Ragglestock's work. And there was Solya, perched on the edge of the fountain, running his fingers through the light in the waters. "I'm glad to see you've rescued yourself," he said, "even though you walked yourself into it as determinedly as you possibly could." He hadn't been in the house at all, but I was sure he knew every detail of Alicia's mortification and mine, and for all his sorrowful expression, I was sure he'd been delighted to watch me make a fool of myself. All this time I'd been grateful that Alicia didn't want my magic or my secrets. It had never occurred to me that she might want something else. Even if it had, I wouldn't have imagined she'd been looking for a target for malice. We weren't stupidly cruel to each other in Dvernik. Of course, there were quarrels sometimes, and people you liked less, and sometimes even a fight broke out if people got angry enough. But when harvest came, your neighbours came to help you gather and thresh, and when the shadow of the woods stole over us, we knew better than to make it any darker. And none of us would have been rude to a witch, no matter what. I would have thought even a noble woman had more sense than that, I said. Solya shrugged. Perhaps she didn't believe you one. I opened my mouth to protest that she'd seen me do magic, but I suppose she hadn't. Not like Ragostok, who would burst into rooms like a thunderclap with showers of glittering silver sparks and birds calling out as they flew in every direction. Not even like Solya, gliding smoothly in and out of shadows in his elegant robes, with those bright, sharp eyes of his that seemed to see everything that went on in the castle grounds. I shoved myself into ball gowns in my own room and walked to parties stubbornly, and in a strangling corset that was quite enough to spend my breath on without doing tricks just to show off. But how did she think I got myself on the list? I demanded. I imagine she thought what the rest of the wizards did at first. What, that you put me on because Sarkhan was in love with me? I said, sarcastic. Marek, more likely, he said, entirely serious, and I stared at him, appalled. Really, Agnieszka, I would have expected you to understand that much by now. I don't want to understand any of this, I said. Those people in there, they were happy for Alicia to mock me, and then they were just as happy for me to make her miserable. Of course, he said. They're delighted to learn that you were playing the yokel only to set up an elaborate mockery of the first person who took your bait. That makes you part of the game. I didn't set a trap for her, I said. I wanted to add that no one would think of something like that, no one in their right mind anyway. Only I had the unpleasant, sticky feeling that some of these people would. No, I didn't imagine you had, Solya said judiciously. But you may want to let people believe you did. They will anyway, no matter what you say. He stood up from the edge of the fountain. The situation's not beyond repair. I think you'll find people much friendlier to you at the dinner tonight. Won't you let me escort you, after all? For answer, I turned on my pointed heel and stalked away from him and his amused huff of laughter, letting my stupid train drag along the ground behind me. I made my thundercloud way out of the neat courtyard and into the noisy bustle of the green outer courtyard of the castle. A heap of hay bales and barrels sat alongside the main road from the outer gates to the inner one, waiting to be loaded somewhere or other. I sat down on one bale to think. I had the horrible, certain feeling that Solya was right about this too. And that meant any courtier who would speak to me right now would only do so because they liked this sort of spiteful game. Anyone decent wouldn't want anything to do with me. But there wasn't anyone else I could talk to, or even ask for advice. The servants and soldiers didn't want any part of me either, nor the officials hurrying on their appointed rounds. As they came past me now, I could see them all throwing doubtful looks in my direction. A fine lady sitting on a hay bale next to the road in my satin and lace finery, my dragging train full of grass and sand, a stray leaf in a well-tended garden. I didn't belong. Worse than that, I wasn't being any use to Kasia or to Sarkhan or anyone back home. I was ready to testify and there wasn't a trial. I begged for soldiers, but none had gone. I'd attended more parties in 3 days than in my whole life before, and I had nothing to show for it but ruining the reputation of one silly girl who'd probably never had a real friend in her life. In a burst of frustration and anger, I called Van Astelem, but slurred deeply, and between one passing wagon and the next, I put myself back into the clothes of a woodcutter's daughter. Good plain homespun, a skirt that wasn't too long for sensible boots to show beneath it, an apron with 2 big pockets on it. I breathed easier at once and found myself suddenly invisible. No one was looking at me anymore. No one cared who I was or what I was doing. There were hazards to invisibility too. While I stood there on the edge of the road, enjoying the pleasure of a deep breath, an enormous carriage swollen out over its wheels on all sides, and 4 footmen hanging off it came rattling past me and nearly knocked me over. I had to jump out of the way into a puddle, my boots squelching and mud spattering my skirts. But I didn't care. I knew myself for the first time in a week, standing on earth instead of polished marble. I went back up the hill in the carriage track, my stride swinging wide and free in my easy skirts, and slipped into the inner court without any trouble. The fat carriage had drawn up to disgorge an ambassador in a white coat, a red sash of office brilliant across his chest. The Crown Prince was there to meet him, with a crowd of courtiers and an honour guard carrying the flag of Polnia and a yellow and red flag with the head of an ox upon it, one I'd never seen before. He must have been coming to the state dinner. I'd been meant to go there with Alicia this evening. All the guards were watching the ceremony with half an eye at least, and when I whispered to them that I wasn't worth taking any notice of them, their eyes slid over me the way they wanted to anyway. Going back and forth from parties 3 times a day from my inconvenient room had been good for one thing at least. I had learned to find my way about the castle. There were servants in the hallways, but all of them were laden under linens and silver, hurrying to make ready for the dinner party. None of them had attention to spare for a mud-spattered scullery maid. I eeled around and through them and made my way down the long, dark corridor to the grey tower. The 4 guards on duty at the base of the tower were bored and yawning with the late hour. "You missed the stair to the kitchen, sweetheart," one of them said good-naturedly to me. "It's back down the hall." I stored that information away for later, and then I did my best to stare at them the way that everyone had been staring at me for the last 3 days, as though I were perfectly astonished by their ignorance. "Don't you know who I am?" I said. "I'm Agnieszka, the witch. I'm here to see Kasia." And to have a look at the Queen, more to the point. I couldn't think why the trial would be put off so long, unless the Queen was trying to give the King was trying to give the Queen more time to get well. The guards all looked at each other uncertainly. Before they could decide what to do about me, I whispered, "Alamak, Alamak," and walked straight on through the locked doors between them. They weren't nobles, so I suppose they weren't inclined to pick a quarrel with a witch. They didn't come after me, at least. I climbed the narrow staircase around and around until I came out on the landing with the hungry imp knocker gaping at me. Taking the round knob felt as though my hand was being licked thoroughly by a lion that was deciding whether or not I would taste good. I held it as gingerly as I could and banged on the door. I had a list of arguments for the willow, and behind them flat determination. I was ready to shove my way past her if I had to. She was much too fine a lady to lower herself to wrestling with me, I suspected. But she didn't come to the door at all, and when I pressed my ear to it, I faintly heard shouting inside. In alarm, I backed up and tried to think. Would the guards be able to knock the door down if I shouted for them? I didn't think so. The door was made of iron and riveted with iron, and there wasn't even a keyhole to be seen. I looked at the imp, which leered back. Hunger radiated from its empty maw. But if I filled it up? I called a simple spell, just some light. The imp immediately began to suck the magic in, but I kept feeding power to the spell until finally a little candle-wavering gleam lit in my hand. The imp's hunger was an enormous pull, guzzling in nearly all the magic I could give, but I managed to divert a narrow silver stream. I let it collect into a tiny pool inside me, and then I squeezed it out. Alamak! And with one desperate jump, I went through the door. It took all the strength I had left. I rolled out onto the floor of the room beyond and sprawled flat on my back, emptied. Footsteps came running across the room to me, and Kasia was at my side. Yeshka, are you all right? The shouting was from the next room. Marek, standing fists clenched in the middle of the floor and roaring at the Willow, who stood ramrod stiff and white with anger. Neither of them paid much attention to my falling in through the door. They were too busy being furious at each other. Look at her! Marek flung out an arm at the Queen. She still sat by the same window as before, listless and unmoved. If she heard the shouting, she didn't so much as flinch. 3 days without a word from her lips, and you call yourself a healer. What use are you? None, evidently, the Willow said icily. All I have done is everything that could be done, as well as it could be done. She did take notice of me then, finally. She turned and looked down her nose at me on the floor. I understand this is the miracle worker of the kingdom. Perhaps you can spare her from your bed long enough to do better. Until then, tend her yourself. I am not going to stand here to be howled at for my efforts. She marched past me, twitching her skirts to one side so they wouldn't even brush up against mine, as if she didn't care to be contaminated. The bar lifted itself at a flick of her hand. She swept out, and the heavy iron door clanged shut behind her, scraping on the stone like an axe blade coming down. Marek turned on me, his temper still unspent. And you're meant to be the foremost witness, and you're wandering around the castle looking like a kitchen slut. Do you think anyone is going to believe a word out of your mouth? 3 days since I got you on the list. You got me, I said indignantly, wobbling up to my feet with the support of Kasia's arm. And all you've done is persuade the entire court you're a useless bumpkin. Now this? Where is Solya? He was supposed to be showing you how to get on. I don't want to get on, I said. I don't care what any of these people think of me. What they think doesn't matter. Of course it matters. He seized me by the arm and dragged me out of Kasia's hands. I stumbled with him, trying to gather together a spell to knock him away, but he pulled me to the windowsill and pointed down to the castle courtyard. I paused and looked down, puzzled. There didn't seem to be anything alarming happening. The red-sashed ambassador was just going into the building with Crown Prince Sigmund. That man with my brother is an envoy from Mondria, Marek said, low and savage. Their prince consort died last winter. The princess will be out of mourning in 6 months. Now do you understand? No, I said, baffled. She wants to be Queen of Polnya, Marek shouted. But the Queen's not dead, Kasia said. And then we understood. I stared at Marek, cold, horrified. But the king, I blurted, he loved. I stopped. He's putting off the trial to buy more time, do you understand? Marek said. Once memories of the rescue have faded, he'll get the nobility to look the other way and then he can put her quietly to death. Now, are you going to help me? Or do you want to keep blundering around the castle until the snow flies and they burn her and your beloved friend here, once it's too cold for anyone to come out and watch? I curled my fingers tight around Kasia's stiff hand, as if I could protect her that way. It felt too cruel and hollow to imagine that we could have won Queen Hannah free, brought her out of the wood, all so the king could cut off her head and marry someone else. Just to add a principality to the map of Polnya, another jewel to his crown. But he loved her, I said again, a protest I couldn't help making. Stupidly, I suppose. Yet that story, the story of the lost beloved queen, made more sense to me than the one Marek was telling me. And you think that would make him forgive being made a fool? Marek said. His beautiful wife, who ran away from him with a Russian boy who sang her charming songs in the garden. That's what they said of her until I was old enough to kill men for saying it. They told me not to even mention her name to him when I was a boy. He was staring down at Queen Hannah in her chair, where she'd sat blank as waiting paper. In his face, I could see him as he'd been, a child hiding in his mother's deserted garden to escape that same crowd of poisonous courtiers, all of them smirking and whispering about her, shaking their heads and pretending at sorrow while they gossiped that they'd known it all along. And you think we can save her and Kasha by dancing to their music? I said. He lifted his gaze from the Queen and looked at me. For the first time ever, I think he really listened to me. His chest rose and fell 3 times. No, he said finally, agreeing. They're all just vultures, and he's the lion. They'll shake their heads and agree it's a shame and pick at the bones he throws them. Can you force my father to pardon her? He demanded, as easily if he wasn't asking me to ensorcel the king and take someone's will away from them, as dreadful as the wood. No, I said, appalled. I looked at Kasha. She stood with a hand resting on the back of the Queen's chair, straight and golden and steady, and she shook her head to me. She wouldn't ask that of me. She wouldn't even ask me to run away with her, to abandon our people to the wood, even if it meant the king would murder her just so he could kill the Queen too. I swallowed. No, I said again. I won't do that. Then what will you do? Marek snarled, angry again, and stalked from the room without waiting for me to answer. It was just as well. I didn't know what to say.
Wow.
Oh, I want more.
Couldn't he have predicted that though? Why did he drag her back to the castle?
Because he's childish.
Because he's riddled with mummy issues.
He could have gone. He could have hung out at the Dragon's Tower.
Yeah, I think he was like, oh, the Willow's the best healer in the whole world. Like, I want the best from the mummy.
I don't think the dragon would have left his tower.
No, he would have. He used to hit the Queen there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't. The dragon was like, we'll have to take her back to the tower.
Yeah, the Queen, but not Marek.
I don't know. It's better to
You've been living in much better putting in a tower and trying to like get her better in the tower before taking her back to the capital.
Yeah.
Which
Frankie's.
I don't understand why she won't just like use the Falcon. Like the Falcon, clearly bad man, obviously.
Oh, I just feel too dirty.
But if she knows he's a bad man, she can use him. You know.
I know, but like even being around men who make your skin crawl is awful. Like I totally see why she doesn't want to do that.
Absolutely.
He doesn't put herself in the tower, so if he like, you know, turned up at the party 10 minutes early and said, "Just humor her," you never know.
What is that over?
What's that? Hi, Liz. Hey, sweetie.
Hi. Hello. Sorry, I've been really missing Storytime.
Missing you.
This week. But isn't it such a fucking good book? Oh my god. I like lost a day of work because I stayed up till 2:30 reading it and I finished it within 24 hours of buying it. Because like the last book I was like, oh, like I'm really bad at listening, so I'll buy the book and that way I can read along. No.
That's why I haven't bought the book.
Yeah.
Can we do a less good book next time? So
No. The next book's going to be Matilda.
What? Which book?
Next book's going to be Matilda.
Oh, that's fine. That's like chocolate. I need to read that. Read that years ago.
Yeah, I feel like it should be pretty chill and everyone should be okay with that.
That's Lee. Thanks, Frankie.
No
Great.
problem. No problem, sweets. We'll have to start. It's not very long though, so we'll have to start thinking what to do next.
Yeah.
I'll put
Pals.
I gotta leave, guys.
Katie.
Goodbye.
Bye. Bye.
See you later.
Thank you.
Next time.
Katie and Nick, do you want to see the art you're inspiring at the moment?
Yes.
Yes.
Always.
So I'm still trying to make my dance headboard, which is a bloody nightmare. I don't know which is the best way to do this. If I do that, but I can't see what's going on the screen, or if I do the reversey camera degree. There we go. I'm sorry, guys. So this Katie and Nick is based on you guys. There was a photo of this you in the pose that's been traced and is now being turned into line drawings. Yay. And then the headboard is currently stressing me out.
Oh, I recognise that.
Yeah, me too.
Indeed. And then there's some other shit in here. There's some of us, Malcolm, somewhere in here as well. But I'm not sure because they look. The ones Malcolm and Frankie always just look a bit more chaotic.
That's about right.
But this is the art that's happening, but it's currently just. That's the end. But yeah, I just thought I'd like to.
That is very exciting. Oh no, she's gone.
Oh no.
Excitement. When you have time in your electronics lab, you become really